Glasses being tossed in the direction of everybody who was here, including us.
They get the F out of here. We don't care that you're pressed.
Thousands of protesters are marching right now through Manhattan.
I do find I'm getting more emotional.
A sea of humanity coast to coast.
From the diner. I had so much anxiety about my son.
There were protests here over the death of George Floyd.
But this was a trauma to everyone.
What does it take to get a more in-depth look into the week's top local news stories? The Debrief brings you inside for a one-on-one conversation with our reporters every week, right here, right now. The Debrief.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Debrief podcast. I'm David Ushery, an anchor of the 4 and 11 at News 4 New York. And it's been a week. It's been a week of reflection, marking the 1 year since Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, 9.5 minutes of his knee on his neck. And we've been observing both in our newscasts and our digital writings what's changed and what hasn't. So we thought we'd spend this podcast this week digging into what we call the reporter's notebook. And that is to say, our reporters take a lot of notes, and then you'll see the ultimate presentation of their stories on the air. But there's a lot of other things in their notebook that maybe don't make it into the story, some of their observations, some of their feelings. And specifically, I wanted to do a deep dive with Black reporters, because never perhaps before have we been tested so much overall as journalists with reporting on two overriding things that not only are happening, but also affect us. One of them would be COVID, because we had the same fears and anxieties for our families as we were reporting on. And the other one is this reflection of race and policing. And I think all of the reporters that you're going to hear from today have spent years covering all aspects of this story. But it's fair to say that it has resonated in a way unlike any other time in our careers. And I'll let them speak to that. And I think there's something to hear about the insight and actually ask us, how have we changed? What's the toll been like? And so I'm joined happily today by Pat Battle, weekend anchor today in New York, longtime reporter in New Jersey, really a force of life, force of nature. Tracy Strahan, battling it out in the morning, the ever important morning show, getting us started for the day. Has been in so many scenes and covered so many of these stories. And both Pat and Tracy are parents, by the way. And Miles Miller spent a lot of time covering a lot of law enforcement, a lot of crime, Black men reporting these issues. So often this is hard for us, right? And I said this a couple of weeks ago to give our own feelings and thoughts. But I think we're at a point in time where we just need to acknowledge it. And I think it's important for other listeners to hear it. So I just want to kick off the conversation and get out of the way. And I guess, Pat, I'll start with you. How have you changed over the last year? How's this affected you?
David, it's changed me in ways that I really didn't anticipate that it would, in that I wanted to become that person who was delivering a message in the way that we're trained to do, right? We are trained to be objective and not to insert ourselves into stories. And it took me back to a conversation I had, obviously, many years ago with the late and the great journalist Ed Bradley. And we were conversing. I was doing a profile on him, and he said, we are journalists who happen to be Black, not necessarily Black journalists, but when you bring what you are, who you are, to any given situation, your Blackness is always ever present. I remember when I was a newspaper reporter and I had to interview the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in New Jersey by telephone. He didn't think, because of my proper English that I was speaking, he didn't think he was talking to a Black reporter, and he was telling me all kind of N-word jokes. When it came time to meet in person and he saw me come into the room, he left. Wouldn't do the interview. Mortified. And something about that said to me, if I can present myself for the next, however long my career is, it's over 30 years now, to a greater audience in a way that makes them empathize, then I have to take that responsibility very seriously. And I do.
I should point out that our reporters, a couple of them are out in the field on assignment, but taking time out to have this conversation. So Miles, we often talk, reporters of color, Black reporters, talk about this added weight sometimes in a newsroom. If a story of race comes up, then, it's felt that we have to kind of represent and carry that. One person called it the burden of race. And it's not that we shy away from it, but it's another added calculation. And yet we strive as any reporter to be seen as objective, to be seen as fair, to be seen as thorough. How does it affect you? You were covering some of the protests. You had to watch that video of George Floyd. It was obviously race was so much a part of this. Talk to me about that experience.
I think I'll say from the outset that I've stopped watching those videos of incidents with police because the idea of continuing to watch the trauma is too much. And luckily for us, there haven't been within the last year incidents much like George Floyd in New York. So I haven't had to do that for work, but it's really a process to sit down and watch those videos. I mean, I watched not one bit of the trial, and I think I also couldn't. There was also the video a couple of months ago in Brooklyn Park in Minnesota, and I couldn't watch that either. But to go back to last summer, I because of the pandemic, in order to help out another reporter who couldn't work nights, I moved to working nights. And that's when the protests would happen. I was also working weekend nights. And so the first couple of days of protests, it started on a Thursday. I worked the morning show on a Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday. I mean, it was a wild situation to watch things burning, to watch the way the police handled people, with such force. The Saturday of protests, I mean, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then to be pushed and shoved and knocked onto the ground by cops. And I don't talk about this because I don't think that in that respect, I didn't think it added that much to the situation. But then I did on Sunday. We were in the middle of this crowd. These cops took a knee with protesters, and then all hell broke loose. They had a bottle of a water bottle with poured concrete in it and threw it into the crowd. And we had a security guard with us. And once they threw that into the crowd, I was gone. Listen, I'm gone. Listen, Velma Scott's son needs to be able to go home. And so I was gone, and I was nowhere near where any of that was happening. We still went live that night. And right before we went live, we got a glass bottle nearly hit our heads. And I'm like, what is going on? So it's the mix of that kind of agitation in the protests, the police being heavy-handed, and then the totality of it is being Black was just like, I mean, it was a lot because you came off the pandemic and covering the pandemic every day. Then you've got what happened to George Floyd, and all of my white friends in my Instagram or in the DMs like, are you okay? And like, honestly, you just want to be okay by yourself. At that, my girlfriend's white, and never once did she say, are you okay? And I thought that would thank you, because like, if I want to talk about it, I'll talk about it with you. And, that just it was such a tough time, and tough to have these conversations with people who look like me too, because we're just tired of talking about it. So that's that.
Yeah, that's fair. The weariness. Tracy, is there an emotional toll on Black reporters that maybe people didn't understand before all this happened and maybe kind of understand now?
Miles used a great word, trauma. We think of trauma as this heavy word where things happen to people that will really, they have to be catastrophic. But this was a trauma to everyone. We all saw the same thing. The protesters saw it, the police saw it, and we saw it. And so that trauma is justified because who wants to see that every day? And as journalists, I always say we have to be read in. We have to be informed. We have to know the latest information details. We need to know the latest video. We couldn't do it. For self-preservation, you can't do that every day. And I think for me, the moment that was the heaviest was the first time my son saw that video. We're a news household. My husband works in news. I work in news. And for my son, who at the time was 8 years old, to see what happened. And my initial thought was cover his eyes, turn it off. But he's a Black boy. So we watched it. And, like I said, we're a news household. So if he had questions, we were ready. But we're not going to sugarcoat it either. I'm not going to subject him to watching that every day. But now this boy, who is my whole being, is part of this trauma that we've all suffered as a nation. And so for us as Black journalists to have to go out every single day, it's another weight. And, Miles did the protest. You're getting stuff thrown at you. We're called names, just like the police. The police are yelling at us at the same time. And then at the end of the day, you go home to even more of it. So I'm glad you used that word as a trauma, not just as journalists, but as a nation. We suffered a trauma because for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, we watched a man die unnecessarily. Unnecessarily. We can say that now. And Patty, you talked about, we have to toe the line usually. This is one where you had an opinion because we all saw the same thing. So how do we report that? We stick to the facts, right? We know what the facts are. We know who the players are in all of this. But you can't fault us for having an opinion on this one because it does resonate, especially with Black journalists, so much.
Good point, Tracy. And go ahead, Pat. And let me just acknowledge that Erica Byfield has joined us, also one of our reporters who cover like that, also a new mom. And Erica, you're joining us midstream, and we're telling our listeners they're getting this podcast real deal. We got reporters in the field. It may be like life now, a little jagged around the edges, but we're getting through it. So we'll just add you in post production. Good luck to them. But we're talking about this perhaps emotional toll, what the toll has been on Black reporters over the last year in covering this, and also striving to always hit our objectivity standards, our fair, our balanced representation. So, Pat, go ahead and make your point, and Erica, just jump on in.
Well, Erica being a new mom, Tracy having an 8-year-old, David, you have a son who's 14. My son is 23. And as I'm sitting here on the New Jersey Turnpike, I am reminded of a story that captivated this region back in 1998 when 4 young men in a van coming home from college were fired on by 2 state police a little bit south of where I am now, about 20 miles south of where I am now. Unarmed, innocent, just suspicious, or driving erratically, something to that effect.
I remember.
You remember that story? They were indicted, but then they were acquitted. My son is 23, and I don't feel any less anxiety when he leaves the house today.
Amen.
Than I did a year ago before George Floyd was murdered. I still have the same talk with him. He left the house one night. He goes, hey, he went to a 24-hour diner with friends. That's why diners are 24 hours, right? So anybody can go at any time. He left at 1:30 in the morning because that's what kids do. I was up until the minute, after an hour, I texted. And I stayed awake until he got home. And I just couldn't. I'm not worried about what happens in the diner. I'm worried what happens on the way to and way home from the diner. I have so much anxiety about my son. Can't walk the dog with a hoodie on. I'm sorry. I know it's cold. I know it's raining. Please take the hoodie off still. And so, when you ask how I changed, I think I've become even more cautious because what I see and more untrustworthy, unfortunately, because what I've seen in the years since George Floyd passed is more killings. Adam Toledo, Daunte Wright. It's as though some parts of the country this resonated with, and in others it went unheeded. Even though the whole world was captivated by what happened to George Floyd. When I look at police departments around the country and I see what happened in Virginia to the Army. Oh yes, Army lieutenant.
A member of the Army. Sure.
Right. Yeah. And the way that they treat us, it's like that. It's just, why is our skin color still weaponized? That's what, and I say that to my son all the time. I will never, I don't think, feel completely relaxed when he walks out of the house after 10 o'clock at night, and during the day too.
But I want to get Erica Beitel in because, again, Erica's on assignment. Erica, I know you and I have talked about this off camera, so just give us your thoughts, reflections personally, a Black reporter over the last year, and the toll and how it's impacted you and what you think listeners should know. Listeners who come to this conversation who may not have considered or figured this about what Black reporters might have been up against or considering when they have to cover these stories that are so infused with race. What is it that you think they should know? What do you want to reflect?
I think I have to go back to that mom comment because I think my whole world has shifted since I had now 2 children. I have a boy who's 2.5 and a girl who's 8 months old. And every single time I look at my son, even he's just 2.5 years old, I look at him, like Pat just mentioned, going out the door each day. And I think, I hope everyone realizes that he's loved, he's sweet, he's adorable, and just love him as a person. And I hate the fact that I now think that every single time I see him. I study his features. I love him that much, and I want everyone else to love my son that much. And David, I know I've come to you in the hallways, maybe, I think it was like last year on this time, I was like, how do you do it? Looking to you 3, honestly, for guidance, because I'm so worried about my son and now my daughter. Hopefully with women, we don't have to be as concerned, but obviously we do know that we do. And those are the thoughts that run through my head as we're working on these stories. I see young people out and about, and I know I can tell you, I always made it a point when we were, we call it MOS, just looking for random people on the street to talk to. But I now make it even more of a point to make sure that the people that we talk to and we put in our stories are that much more diverse. I want to make sure that people hear from people who look like all of us, who have something astute to say. I mean, my photographers are probably very annoyed with me. I'm like, nope, we need one more. We're going to stand here. We're going to find someone who can level with everyone else out there, who people will ultimately respect. I mean, it's hard to say, or I feel bad saying that, but there are certain other people that you can interview who kind of dismiss their comments. I want people to know that there are people out there who should be respected, and voices need to be included in our coverage.
That's an important point. I think people ask as journalists and reporters how we address some of these issues, and these conversations have been going on now in newsrooms as a result of this. How we diversify our representation of the audience in order to address some of this disconnect. In other words, sometimes it's benign neglect. You go out, you're under a deadline, you need the first 3 sound bites on a story that you can get so you can meet the deadline. And those 3 sound bites, over time, if they tend to be white people speaking on any number of issues, then you don't get a sense that there are Black financial experts or Black medical experts who can speak to issues that are not race related. But it's only until you get to that point where the audience sees that there are people of all stripes and all colors who can speak to a number of subjects that we start to address these issues. But it does require, Erica, that kind of additional effort. And it requires this newsroom-wide effort. And so one of the conversations, frankly, we had is like, all right, how do we diversify our roster of experts so that they appear on these stories? And you've seen maybe, so if you talk about a legacy or some things that it may be, I said a couple weeks ago, the second tragedy or the second killing of George Floyd would be if nothing changed, right? But I do think that we start to see people more open to the conversations, and frankly, I think we've had throughout our careers as to why it may take a little extra time, a little extra effort, but these things need to be made a priority.
It goes from one of those things where we're covering the facts to the sentiment, the feeling of these things. And that's what made this one that much more difficult, from the initial incident to the verdict. Am I right? When that verdict broke, it harkened back to 90s OJ, how's this gonna go? We were, as a newsroom, prepared for riots. We were, as a newsroom, prepared for violence with security guards given to us. And, then we have our family saying, are you sure you're going to go out into this? We have no choice. That's what we do. And quite frankly, I thought we would be going into it too, if I'm being honest. If there had been some sort of acquittal of Derek Chauvin, we were prepared for the worst. With that not happening, what a difference the day afterwards was. I start my day I start work at 2:00 in the morning. I've seen looting in Soho as a result of this. I've seen the occupied kind of city hall situation, that encampment they had set up, protesting George Floyd, or Derek Chauvin. We were prepared really for the worst. And it's a lot to psych yourself up against. I'm sure, David, to be the one that delivers this breaking news, I don't know where your head was in, especially verdict day.
It was. We were sitting. I've never seen this before. I was sitting. We were waiting, sitting in the newsroom, and I mean the silence. And at that particular moment, I'm looking around. At that particular moment, there weren't many African Americans in the newsroom. I was one at that particular moment.
We all out working.
Or getting ready to.
Because we got plenty of black people who work behind the scenes here too. So let's.
Amen.
Yes, we do. And an important part about that, Miles, is that, and we've had a couple of them say that to us, like we're visible on air, so people want to, they want to hear our thoughts because they can most connect with us. But the people who are the producers, the writers in the room who don't have that, it's tremendously difficult on them as well. And reflecting on what they're up against in the videos and the sound bites that are chosen and the calculus that have to be made. So we need to remember those people behind the scenes of color as well. But Trace, it was a palpable, I held my breath. People held their breath because if it had been, and here's the point, people had to hold their breath. Some were saying, and Chelsea Handler got in real trouble for this, saying bypass the justice altogether, but some were saying, how is this even an issue where we might even doubt whether it's guilty after seeing that? But I didn't think it was automatically guilty.
It was not a slam dunk. This was not a slam dunk because we've certainly, especially in issues of race, we've seen it go the other way. And as African Americans, there's a weariness there. We don't expect anyone to be held accountable, especially in law enforcement. Now, I just had a big interview that I did with 3 members of the NYPD. And I talked to them about being Black on the job, especially in this climate. And guess what? They also thought Derek Chauvin gave them a bad name. So that's why I said this was one of these incidents where we all saw the same thing and many people felt the same thing. And even they weren't sure which way it was going to go, but they knew it was going to make their jobs a hell of a lot harder, every single day, because they're getting it from their own kind. And they're getting it from everybody else. But I just, that verdict, I was really thinking about you in particular, David. I said, boy, if we have to break into programming and you have to be the one to say this,
yeah,
you're the face of it.
Yeah.
I find so, and that's a very good point. I want to hear what you guys say, because I do find since over the year, you say, what changed? I do find I'm getting more emotional faster. Usually I would keep emotions in check. But like Pat battled this story this week, and particularly when I hear young Black people speak and really voice their pain and frustration, I find that emotion rises up in me almost on air more than it did. Not that I didn't feel it before, but I just feel when you talk about a year of change, and maybe pandemic is not a lot to do with that, just life and the weariness. And I think that's something that, to your point, Miles, you're like, look, if you need, I'll tell you if I need to talk. But I do think that as reporters, all of us, mental health is not something that has been addressed with all the trauma that we cover, terror attacks, and now COVID, and then this. And that would be for some white reporters or non-Black reporters as well. And that's something else that I wonder, as a legacy of this, we might be able to talk more about. Do you guys see yourself being more open and honest about the emotion?
Two things. I think newsroom leadership is important, right? And you having people who look like you in newsroom leadership makes it easier to be able to talk about how this story makes you feel emotionally, and why or not you think you can't cover this story, right? Because in some instances you simply cannot cover something like a certain incident because it just is too painful to cover, and we have to be okay with that. There's a conversation being had about burnout across the country, reporters who are leaving the industry, leaving journalism, taking breaks from journalism because they are burned out. But I think that the moment for me that was most impactful was I got a call from our managing editor at some point in June. And he's like, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "Honestly, terrible. Honestly, very terrible. Like, there's been the worst 2 weeks for me in my career. It's been a lot. We had COVID. And then after COVID, we were going directly into these protests. And the hardest part about all of it was the way police responded and how rude and nasty and how physical they were with reporters, and specifically with me, which I really did not like. But then second, the people in the movement who forgot that the movement was about Black lives. And when I say that, I mean, on Juneteenth, we're walking across the Brooklyn Bridge, and they're telling us that my crew shouldn't be on the bridge with them. And I said, "Did you forget that this is Juneteenth, which is about Black people and the end of slavery? Can you just fix your mind to think about the larger meaning of all this, and the fact that I have a Black face and you don't have a Black face, and that perhaps that is what we're all talking about here. You're missing the message." And it just was, and my security guard was Black. My photographer was Dominican, and one of my photographers, both of my photographers were Dominican that day. It just was, it was such a moment of like, let's take a second and like, and think about this. Think about all that's happening right now. It's Juneteenth. Like, I'm the last person you need to be yelling at for being here covering this movement.
David, if I could
go ahead.
You talked about what has changed in us over the last year, and I think I still find myself asking the question that I asked so many people in the last year since George Floyd, and that question was, is this a tipping point, a turning point? Is this really going to signal change? I can't tell you how many times I've asked that question to a variety of people, from public officials to young people, and I wish I could answer it myself and say, yeah, because for a while I felt it. And what Miles was saying about the diversity of the movement, that gave me, while some people were like, don't try to, take over our movement, I felt that the diversity of it was really the sign that this could be, a turning point, with so many whites and Asians and Dominicans and, Latinx folks and older people, especially the young people who joined in this global movement and force for change. And so what disappoints me now is that I see the support for BLM, which people needed to be reminded, started with Trayvon Martin, 3 young women, when Trayvon Martin was killed. I see that support dwindling in a tangible or visible sense. I mean, not that there should be a protest every week, but I was reading a New York Times article last weekend about the dwindling support for the movement particularly among whites, who were very visible and in marching right alongside the Blacks and Latinos and Asians during the height of the protests. And that's what bothers me. I don't want this to be a moment in history where there's not a new chapter being written, where it's just another page, not a chapter or a whole new book. And that, I think, is what drives me to keep trying to push for the stories that we do. And you mentioned finding Black folks. I've never seen so many Black folks in commercials in all my life, from Home Depot. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
It's like,
And they stopped playing those. And they stopped playing the urban music track under it too. It's like, I mean, come on.
Well, there's still a lot of dancing going on, but
I think it's a good point, Pat, and the legacy. We've seen those changes, corporate America, and some changes, but is it a real inflection point? How much of it will be sustainable? Let me wind it up this way, because we go on for hours, we know. But let me just wind it up, bring it back to reporters and journalists. All 3 of you have your professional relationships with law enforcement. You have to. Trace, early in the morning, you've got to have your sources, your people, because there's little information. Pat, for years, and covered the state of Jersey, and also even some family ties to law enforcement. And Miles obviously has worked in various aspects of city government, but also covering it. So you all have your relationships with law enforcement. Moving forward, I would say that I'm going to have the viewers of our market trust me because they've seen me a long time and seen this a long time. So when we report a story, they'll accept that I'm giving the best representation of it as I can. But that being said, where race was so much a part of it and our emotions are so much a part of this one, moving forward, how do you proceed with these kinds of stories, law enforcement stories? Technically, nothing changes, but what do you see happening differently in either your relationships with your sources, your representation of your stories, anything? I'm getting it back to journalism for the podcast listeners when they see you moving forward and they might have these questions in their mind. Tracy?
Well, we keep using this word reckoning, right? We always say this is a moment of reckoning when it comes to the George Floyd incident. And it's a reckoning that has to happen in that relationship as well, right? There has to be accountability for law enforcement. There has to be greater transparency on both ends because, not all journalists are great apples either. There's bad apples everywhere. But at the end of the day, we're trying to get the facts that will help tell an accurate story. And we need transparency and accountability from law enforcement to do that. Now, as an African-American woman, am I the first one that they may go to? I don't know, but I have just as much credibility as anyone else. So that has to be seen and acknowledged, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've taken a real look at stories I've covered in the past. I mean, I think the most important thing in light of George Floyd is harm reduction when it comes to being a journalist and how we cover these stories. I'll say that if you looked at the press release that the Minneapolis Police Department put out about George Floyd's death, you would not believe what happened to him is the same thing that you saw in that press release. That video and the press release tell two different stories. And so I've made an effort ever since June of last year to scrutinize everything more than I already have. Number one, to talk to, in some stories, we have a rule of two sources on a story. If it's a source story, I call people all morning. I want to hear from seven different people, the story, and make sure it's the same way with every person. And when it's not, go back and figure out where the piece is missing, and then be very mindful of the stories that I do that involve the police department. And those stories for me going forward will always be process stories. So if it's a story in which it's about the police department, it's about the process, how they're tracking down a certain type of crime, or how they are how the warrant squad goes after criminals. But it's not going to be anything other than that. It won't be rappelling out of a helicopter or riding along just to ride along. Those stories do a disservice to our viewers, I think, when you are a Black reporter, because you are now a black face of the police department's propaganda, and you have to curb that, I think, because you have to get back to the basics of this is news, and we are, and at this time, we really have to be even more accountable about the stuff we're putting on TV as it relates to policing. We've got a crime issue in the city, and that is the story we have to hone in on it in every way.
Pat, I'm going to give you the last word and pick up where Miles left off. And I'm going to give you a lot to sum up here, because on the other hand, we do know there are heroic law enforcement officers, honorable law enforcement officers, and we need law enforcement officers as a society. What that role is or what it looks like is being debated, right? But you moving forward, covering race and policing through the lens of a post-George Floyd era, you've always covered the issue. Moving forward and maintaining that relationship with your viewers, what's all that calculus in your mind, which again is an additional calculus that a white reporter probably doesn't have to make, being straight up, but just sum it up for us. Tell us how you move forward.
David, let me start by saying, I think some of our viewers, I know Miles, you and Tracy are very well aware that my mother was a police commissioner, the first African-American and woman to serve in that capacity. Some say the state, don't quote me on that, but I definitely know it was anywhere that I'd ever heard of in New Jersey. So but that was an appointed position. She didn't go through the ranks. She didn't go to the academy. But when she was elected, also first, she wanted, they were like, Mrs. Battle, why don't you, why don't we appoint you mayor? She said, no, I think it can have more impact if I am in charge of the police department. This was 1973, coming out of the riots following the death of the assassination of Martin Luther King, Kennedy, et cetera, et cetera. And she did just that. And she held cops accountable. She taught me that one thing: cops are people. They are human beings. They come to the job with the same biases and the same thought patterns, the same influences that so many of us bring to our own. That's my alarm. Excuse me. So I think that I go into this every day. I try to look at people and see the good before I look for anything else. And if I approach you from that perspective, that I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and tell me, what's happening, and tell me the truth, and then, because I'm pretty good at deciphering truth from fiction. And I think that when I approach people with that modicum of respect that we all deserve, when you're in any situation, I find that rather than approaching it from an immediate, I don't trust you, I know you're not going to tell me, the truth. I think that we all have a responsibility as human beings to look at each other in the roles that we play in society and to try to make it a better place. And that's where, when I talk to cops now, I come from a place of, where I'm coming from. I'm just, you're looking at me. There's no denying who this is, right?
Mask or not.
Mask or not. That's notwithstanding. And I think that I really do feel that among a lot of the law enforcement officers that I've run into since George Floyd, I think there is a growing, when I say growing, it's a seedling. There's a growing sense of, let me back off and see this person as a human being before I automatically look at them as a Black person. And I'm telling you that it is not something that they are trained to do. They have to, just like us, walk through life and look in the mirror when they get home and see, how did I treat those people that I encountered today? That police officer in Virginia, I think I actually cried when I saw that.
I did too.
My dad served in the Air Force. My dad was a radar specialist. He was he was on his way to medical school until he met my mother and they started having children. Every summer, we would drive down this turnpike where I sit right now, and we would go to Mississippi or North Carolina, where my parents were born. And once we went south of that Mason-Dixon line, there was not one summer that we did not get pulled over. My dad driving in a suit and tie with his hands on the steering wheel, because we couldn't stop. We couldn't stop at a restaurant. We were lucky if when we stopped for gas, they'd let us use the bathroom. We couldn't sleep in a hotel. I'm old enough to remember that. And the cop walking up to my dad, radar specialist, Air Force veteran, smarter than, I'm sorry, I shouldn't put it in that context.
These are your feelings.
Yeah, these are my feelings.
Yes, these are your feelings.
With his hand on his gun, where you going, boy? And my dad sitting there, and my mom, my dad sitting there, hands on the steering wheel, the position, assume the position, and going down south to see my family. Sir, where your family at, boy? My family, he'd tell them where we are, and then he'd look at us, and he said, all these little, and I'm going to not use the word, starts with a P, not the word. But I remember when I was 5 years old, all these little, yours? And my father said, yes, they are, sir. They range in age. And to sit there, and it was just a humiliating line of questioning that they endured every single time we went, and multiple times. That we wouldn't just get stopped once, always once we got out of D.C. We're in Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, North Carolina, anywhere south. It was humiliating. And even when my mother had her badge, she'd sit in the driver's seat, she'd hand her badge to my dad to show him she was a police commissioner. That ain't yours, gal. Where the hell, Neptune? That's some kind of planet, and my mother, not once did that badge do her any good when we were driving south. We never got a ticket, by the way. He never got a ticket because he was never doing anything except being a Black man in a blue station wagon with wood paneled sides and a bunch of children inside. So, but my father's dignity, even under those circumstances, taught me something too. You try to treat people with dignity, now you may burn them in the end, but to try to get to where we need to go to get the information, there's an approach to it that for me has changed a little bit since George Floyd. But it will always be in search of truth. And I think I've become a lot more cynical when it comes, to the answers that I get. And so I do a lot more digging. And
all right, that's and that's a powerful representation. Just to remind listeners that times in these matters of race, as Black reporters, we've had personal experiences. Our families have had personal experiences, and yet we come to the job as any reporter does, and any assignment as any reporter does, trying to set that aside and report the facts as much as we can. But it doesn't mean we're not informed by some of the emotional moments in our lives that had experienced. And George Floyd's death probably at least opened others' eyes and allowed Black reporters to kind of say, yeah, now you get a little bit of where I'm coming from and what I've experienced in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have beforehand. Pat Battle, Tracy Strahan, Miles Miller, thank you for the work that you do. We're going to let you get back at it because we all got to get out there and pay those bills. Now, we want to thank Melissa Mack, who's the executive producer who put this together and put most of our coverage together. And we appreciate it. And she's one of the people behind the scenes, and we appreciate her. We thank the digital team, Darren Price, who she'll work with. Whatever this final product comes out to be, Melissa and Darren will have fixed it because we had some pickups along the way. Some of them you may hear, some of them you may not, technically. And Ben Berkowitz leads the digital team. I'm David Usher. Thank you for joining us.